I've followed you with the NEPA, the NRDC decision that you worked on. And I want to ask you a couple of things with this whole NEPA and siting of cell towers. So I'm not an attorney, and neither are most of the people in this room, but I'm still a little confused about who exactly does the National Environmental Policy Act apply to, and who's responsible for completing the environmental analysis, and under what circumstances. I think a lot of people who work on cell tower issues wonder about this as well.
Yeah, well, so the National Environmental Policy Act is a federal statute. So it applies to federal agencies like the Federal Communications Commission. And how that plays out in this context is that it is technically and legally, it is the obligation of the FCC to comply with NEPA. So any violation of it, like when I go to court, I'm suing the FCC. But how it is playing out as cell phones and various networks are constructed around the country is that the FCC has essentially passed off its environmental review obligation to the companies who are constructing these networks. They have an obligation to certify that they are in compliance with the FCC's RF standards, and if they are not, then submit an environmental assessment to the FCC so that it, the agency, can fulfill its legal obligations.
Okay, and I guess one of the other things that comes up a lot is, the section in the Telecommunications Act that limits placement of cell towers on the grounds of health or environmental effects. And I wonder how you appeal this. So many people who are on this program have worked on cell towers coming to their cities, and how do they address it? Some people say you can talk about health effects. I know when I've been in city council meetings and so forth, they don't really discuss it. The attorneys don't, the people in the audience can, and those testifying, but how does that work for health and environmental effects?
Yeah, so you certainly could talk about it. The legal ability for the city or a county to do something about it is limited under the Telecommunications Act, and this is the issue that I discussed in terms of the Congress has chosen to concentrate authority into the federal agency, the FCC, and it has preempted a certain amount of legal authority that local governments have. But it is critically important to discuss and get those local officials to engage with the FCC in its fulfillment or failure to fulfill its obligations related to environmental review. And in fact, in the recent case, which we'll get into discussion a little bit more later this morning, the challenge in the DC Circuit to the termination order of the FCC's review of its RF standards. NRDC filed an amicus brief, a Friends of the Court brief in that case, and we were joined by a number of local elected officials who do feel that their hands are tied and care very much where these RF standards are set, and so that they are set in a way that adequately protects their constituents.
Great, and more work needs to be on that. So there's another question also. What about, I think this may be another discussion for the policy at the very end, but one of the questions is, do you think it's possible to get the EPA back into working on this issue?
Absolutely, and we need to. I mean, these are political choices, and so in the end, it's about funding that Congress gives and the mandate that goes with that. It's about the political leadership of the Environmental Protection Agency, but they potentially have very critical expertise that needs to be engaged in these issues, and they're not now. And it's certainly possible through politics that they can be going forward.
What's been the response to this EMF appeal? And do you think it's made a difference?
Yes, Cindy, thank you for asking me that question because, when you put out a big appeal like this, you don't always know what's going on. But I can tell you from the responses that we have gotten directly that people view this appeal as very credible and very authoritative. In fact, that's why we put it together. In 2014, some of the scientists got together and they said, we've been issuing appeals about EMF for over almost 2 decades now. And we're doing it for various nations and we're signing appeals that people bring to our attention. But let's get together and get all the scientists who are willing to join us to sign this international appeal and go directly to the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the UN Environment Program, and all UN member nations. So that's what we did. And the reason why it continues to be so highly valued, the reason why scientists continue to ask us to add their names to it, we just had a new signature last week, is because they realize this, that they feel comfortable signing in with other peer scientists who have also published papers in in professional journals, peer-reviewed papers. They feel comfortable doing that. Not all scientists feel comfortable signing an advocacy petition, but they're signing this one because they're in each other's company. And this appeal has been it's published in a professional journal. It's been used in public testimony, in legislation, by the media, and in advocacy. So we feel that it has its own life and it will continue to be used as a resource. And we amended it 2 years later. It was issued in 2015. We amended it 2 years later, the advisors did, by when 5G arrived, by advising safety testing of 5G.
Wonderful. I mean, all of this just shows your expertise in this matter, really broad expertise. Do you have any thoughts? We haven't really brought it up and we probably will bring it up again, but the FCC lawsuit that's ongoing now to reevaluate the safety standards for RF radiation seems to be sort of the basis for a lot of this, is these sort of flawed, obsolete rules that state that the regulations there and the standards are only based on heat and not on the biological effects. So they don't take into account other aspects of this, biologic mechanisms, et cetera. Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yes, sure. I'd love to comment on that. That's a very important case right now before the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit. And it based on the Administrative Procedures Act set by the U.S. Congress. Scott McCullough, who is the lead attorney, presented the case in oral arguments last week, pointed out quite rightly major violations to the Administrative Procedures Act on the part of the FCC in the way they're managing under the Federal Telecom Act, the way they're managing the spectrum and not listening to a large number of comments that have been made since 2012, for example, raised by people in the United States and from other countries as well, because this FCC guideline is very influential on other nations. Been ignored. These comments have been ignored. And by the way, I was one of the appellants in a similar case raising the same arguments starting back in 1998 after the FCC revised their human exposure guidelines in 1996. We challenged them at that time as well. And that case took 3 years before they had oral arguments. And then at that time, there was a heightened awareness of these violations and what needs to be done to make the FCC more accountable under that law. So here we are again, thank goodness. And I'm hoping that this time we will prevail.
Great, Libby. We have a couple questions I'm going to ask now. Where can we find the video of Dr. Blank? Dr. Martin Blank.
Oh, the video can be found on the International EMF Scientist Appeal. It's right on the homepage, emfscientist.org. And I'd just like to say, the appellants bringing this case on against the FCC right now include the Environmental Health Trust and Children's Defense Fund. And they both are working very hard to support this case, and you need to support them.
Okay, great. And I guess this is another question that we're probably going to ask to some of the other panelists, but with regards to the UN, there's a question, do they have a conflict of interest in this manner?
Most definitely they do. And the other point is the head of the EMF project, which is in their Office of Radiation within the World Health Organization, she's an electrical engineer, and she inherited this post from Dr. Michael Repicelli in Australia, who was probably the mastermind behind the placement of that office in the World Health Organization. He was the first director of it until the mid 2000s. And also he selected the current director to follow him. And so she's been under his guidance. And he also established ICNIRP, the International Agency on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, who are now recognized by the United Nations formally as an affiliate organization. And they collaborate with that EMF office within the WHO, traveling all over the world, promoting harmonization of standards by nations. Yes, this is a conflict of interest.
I have another sort of a related question about the Communications Workers of America. What is their stance on this?
I don't
in
know
regards
what
to this.
I don't know what their stance is currently, but at the time we filed our appeal in 1998, there were 3 appeals filed at the same time. One was from a group I was working with, the 54 people across the United States who had made comments earlier and therefore had standing. We formed an organization and submitted our appeal.
And this is in 1987, right? This is your lawsuit against the FCC.
1998.
Or 1998, I'm sorry.
The second group was Arthur Furstenberg's group, Cell Phone Task Force, on behalf of about 28 people who were electrically hypersensitive, including Arthur. And thirdly, the Communications Workers of America. And Morton Baer, the president of CWA, filed this on behalf of the, 14,000 or so telecom workers, as well as the IBEW workers. IBEW is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And they filed based on health concerns because they felt that, well, there's a body of science showing that occupationally workers, whether they're telecom or electrical workers, or they're just air conditioning installers or roofers, are being more highly exposed than the general population, and they know it. Today, I don't know what their position is, although Richard Blumenthal had a union leader with CWTA from the New England states on with him when he had a press conference with B. Blake Levitt 2 years ago now, talking about the 5G and lack of safety testing. So I'm sure if you were to speak to these union leaders, you would get their position.
Great, Libby. Wow, it's so much history in this, and so many years people have been working with this. I just want to remind people that the Environmental Health Trust is a lead petitioner on the FCC lawsuit, and they can supply a link. We can send that in the chat, and we're going to be talking a little bit later about that, probably with Theodora. Okay, here's an interesting question. Has anybody tried from these organizations contacted the Pope directly?
The Pope?
Yeah.
I
don't know.
People have repeatedly tried to contact everybody in power that they can think of, including the Pope, the Surgeon General of the United States, their Congress, of course, members of Congress, celebrities. We're all thinking along the same lines here. We're also trying to involve all the natural environmental groups, which have been largely silent because they've been sidetracked. They're focusing on different things, and they're not that doesn't include electromagnetic fields. Why is that? And so you wonder whether they've been co-opted, why they just don't see this as an issue, considering the fact that there are birds being affected, migratory birds. And there's a new paper coming out on Nature that's being published by, was authored by B. Blake Levitt, Dr. Henry Lai, and Al Manville, who's a wildlife biologist, used to be with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And his research on migratory birds, he has testified before Congress about. This paper on Nature is a huge effort, and it will be published soon. And you will see the incredible body of reports on vertebrate and invertebrate animals and all living organisms down to microbes showing radiation effects. And that's been discussed during this conference, by Sharon Goldberg. I mean, it's enormous body of evidence that hopefully will get out there and maybe bring these other groups into it.
Great. And that wildlife study, is that available now online or no?
It's pending. Publication is pending.
Okay. I want to ask a couple questions of you. And you've talked about how other countries have more stringent laws in regards to wireless and cell antenna exposure, but can you talk more about the process by which these countries have made these decisions and compare their evaluations to the United States, for example, Cyprus and France, and how come they're able to be more effective in this?
Well, that's a very good question because it hasn't been as easy as it may seem. And I want to just mention in France, for example, the work of PhoneGate Alert. And Dr. Marcarazzi actually had to pressure the government by a court case to ensure that they released tests that they'd done on hundreds of cell phones, tested at body contact, where they found that the radiation exposures exceeded government limits. But that took a court case. Then that information became public. Then they actually changed the way the European Commission tested phones so that they were closer to the body, still not at body contact. So this is something that's very important. Our cell phones and wireless devices are not even tested the way we use them, which is touching the body. And that is an example of a challenge there. I know Dr. Stella Michailidou has been working hard, and there are scientists who have been putting out this information, speaking up, and calling for protective policies. So I can't say that it's been that easy. In some of these countries where the science has been done, like Italy, where you have the Ramazzini Institute, they are maintaining their stricter radio frequency radiation limits. Now, those limits are not what we would say fully protective yet because of this myriad of effects that are found in the literature at levels even lower, but they're certainly far lower than ICNIRP or FCC limits, which are among the highest in the world when it comes to cell tower networks.
Yeah, so there are some brave, very brave and outspoken scientists and physicians who have been working on this that sort of take the lead, is what I'm understanding, and also community leaders. What other legal actions are moving forward internationally related to 5G and cell towers? A few.
There is legal action in India, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia. So all across the world, there's actions being taken, and depending on the federal laws that are in place, they can do different things. So in Australia, there's actions moving forward because of the way the government, the laws of the government that actually we can't necessarily do here. But
Okay.
we are looking forward to these actions coming forward.
Yes, and I understand. I know there is a Stop 5G International group, and there have been last year so many protests throughout the world on action days, and you've highlighted it in your Environmental Health Trust, and people all around the world are very concerned about this and the cell towers that are coming.
One thing I would add is that the World Health Organization has two entities, and the EMF project is different than the International Agency for the Research on Cancer. We have on our website a letter where we asked Emil van Deventer questions similar to what Libby Kelly was talking about. Who is picking the teams that are going to update the monograph? And they have been unanswered since 2019. They have not answered our questions. Who wrote the fact sheets, which are online at the World Health Organization, that governments and cell tower companies put forward as proof of safety? Well, there's a little known fact I'd like to point out, and that is that on the World Health Organization EMF project site, they show that their last monograph on this was from 1993.
Wow.
So one of the questions that we had was, how did you come up with these fact sheets for the public that seem to say all's clear and there's no proven effects when there hasn't been an adequate review? And I do wish that we could file legal proceedings to sort of look at that, because it seems to me that you can't make a determination or an evaluation unless there's been a full systematic review of the science. The other thing I want to point out, I know I have one more minute, is that none of these limits were developed to protect birds, bees, trees, our natural environment.
Right.
And so this is an area that needs all of our attention, because how can we be deploying all of these antennas when there's actually been no limits ever set where we even looked at this issue?
Right.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And I mean, we look at all of these EMF mitigation devices and how to protect ourselves and shield our homes and so forth. But the birds and the bees and the animals, they don't really have that, especially with 5G and space coming. And we'll talk more about it. Why did Environmental Health Trust decide to enter in a legal appeal? And when do you expect a ruling in this case?
Thank you. So we may not get a ruling for 4, 6, or even a year. We decided to enter because it was so clear that the Federal Communications Commission had not adequately reviewed the record. And we had oral arguments on Monday, January 25th. You can go online to ehtrust.org to watch those, as well as watch our press conference. And in those oral arguments, it was clear the judges really had read the briefs which were put forward and said things like, Robert Wilkins said, "I'm just going to be upfront with why I'm inclined to rule against you," to the FCC lawyer, in a line of questioning which showed that they were trying to get at how can you determine that there is safety when we're not seeing the documentation from the FDA, from the expert agencies of the FDA. And they also brought forward the issue of what about cumulative exposure? Because of course our limits were not set looking at long-term exposure. And they really, the judges' pointed questions pointed out that they are really taking a hard look at that. And so we are looking forward to the decision, which unfortunately will be a couple months from now, but at least it won't be a decade from now. And some of these brain cancer cases that are winding through the courts, it's egregious that most of the people have passed away in these cases and how long it takes. So this legal appeal was a vehicle to open up the reality that we don't have limits that protect us from long-term exposure. They are outdated and they need to be updated to be protective of people and the environment.
I do want to let you know that we're delighted to have Blake Levitt join us for the panel discussion. I believe Blake is on, is that right?
I think I am, yes.
Great, fantastic. And many of you know of Blake's work. She's an award-winning medical and science journalist and former New York Times contributor and author of many publications, including Electromagnetic Fields, A Consumer's Guide to Issues and How to Protect Ourselves. She's also the editor of a wonderful book, Cell Towers, Wireless Convenience or Environmental Hazard. Proceedings of the Cell Towers Forum, State of the Science, State of the Law. It's a truly classic book, has a lot of information. She's an engaging and clear writer, and her works are really classics to read. And I know when I've read them and filed them, and I'm like, wow, I got to go back to Blake's article. And she's written a new one now on wildlife and wireless communication. It's titled Low-Level Ambient Electromagnetic Fields Affect Wildlife, Why It Matters, What Can Be Done. So we're all looking forward to reading that. Blake Levitt's also been an invited speaker at U.S. congressional briefings, and she's also a former member of the New York Academy of Sciences. So welcome. Thank you, Blake, for joining us today.
Thank you. I feel like I owe the panel an apology for not having done an official paper with this.
Well, we are just very pleased to have you here. So there's no worries. Everybody understands. I'm going to start with Doug Wood, the last speaker. And how do you go about, now you've discussed how to go about raising awareness about the hazards of wireless radiation in communities. And everybody really wants to have the latest technology. Do you want to expand on this a bit and your approach to people who want to have this technology?
Sure. First of all, I'm delighted to be on this panel with so many friends and really smart people. And so I'm going to speak a little bit, but I'd like to hear from them as well. Look, clearly, people don't understand that there's a trade-off here between their desire for, faster speed. I mean, I'm watching the TV last night. Every other ad was for 5G, and every ad was promising blazing fast speeds. And these people are standing there looking at their cell, and I'm thinking, what is it that you need such speed for? It's not. So I think there's a real disconnect here. I think the public is hungry for 5G, but they have no idea what it is. They have no idea that it's not really, your phone is not all of a sudden going to make your cup of coffee for you. It's going to be your same phone. It's going to do the same things that it has always done. And so I think we need to have a little bit of reality check here. What is it that you're expecting from 5G? And do you understand what the trade-offs are? And so many people don't. I think one of the things that I didn't really lean on in my presentation that I'd like to emphasize is that in a lot of our work, we concentrate on the parents of young children. You know, changing social behavior is really hard. Adults get stuck doing what they're doing and they're not going to move off the dime, but they might do it for their very young child.
This is Sharon. If maybe I could just pick up on what Doug said, because this point about information, knowing the information so that people can make reasoned choices about those trade-offs, and so that our decision makers can make reasoned choices, and that's where the statute, the National Environmental Policy Act, comes in, because of course it was Congress in passing that statute in 1970 that imposed on our federal government the obligation to collect that information so that it could make sure that the decisions were informed. And there are two problems here. One is that the agency in charge, the Federal Communications Commission, is not an environmental agency. And the second is that they're not, and so therefore they've played fast and loose with doing the environmental review, engaging in the basic requirements of reasoned agency decision making as they look at these issues, as they look at the adequacy of their standards.
Yeah, if I could also add that somewhere along the line, we went from being consumers to being consumed. And so now the industry is telling us what we want rather than the consumers driving the demand. The industry is driving the demand to the consumers. So publications like Computer World and others have already put out articles saying that these, you know, shiny, fast speeds that they're spinning up, they're not even living up to their own promises. So we need to really step back when we see very heavy advertising campaigns. We need to really look at that and say, gee, why do they have to work so hard to try and sell us this? So the public really needs to start learning what this is. And I love that all of our healthcare providers can help to stimulate those conversations through their practices.
I'd like to say something. You know, there is a new study that was just published by Beatrice Gollan last year, and she presented it on the second day of the conference during her designated time, and we brought her back yesterday so she could finish things up. And in that report, she provided evidence that the U.S. State Department ends up agreeing with, and that is that the U.S. diplomats who were posted in Cuba were harmed by microwave radiation and suffered a range of terrible conditions, including brain damage. Some people even had to retire on disability. And so her paper is phenomenal. And the National Academy of Sciences, who is a non-governmental NGO that was founded during the time of Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and whose job was to take the cues from government who ask for studies, government at any level of government in the US, and investigate independently and come up with a report. They did that in November, and they concurred with the report, the publication that Beatrice Gollan published. So now we have the National Academy of Sciences making this finding. Now, what do we do next? To me, this is potentially a game changer. This is science-based evidence. So my question I'd like to pose to all of you is, there are policy implications here that need to be considered. Who should consider them? And what should we ask for? What should we ask to do at this point? Cindy?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I think people can just join in. It's what are the next steps? We have a lot of questions, but yes.
Can I
Does anybody
can I
want-
just jump in for a second? This is Blake
Absolutely.
Levitt. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Libby, I think that the question that you just asked goes directly to your ICBE committee that's forming. The perspective needs to begin to include more RF engineers who can help us delineate how these exposures actually couple with the environment. We have a that's what we've been partly focusing on in the paper. And we went deep into how energy affects and is transmitted through aqueous environments, which is very different than how it's transmitted through air environments. The different ways that different species have developed very unique magnetoreceptors in different environments. That also includes humans. Paper doesn't include humans; its focus is on wildlife. But one of the things that we discovered in looking at how millimeter waves in particular that are being used with 5G, coupled with the environment, was quite a revelation to me when I uncovered this research, and it was coming out of the Russian research that we reviewed, as well as CIA papers that we could extract that would be pertinent to wildlife. But one of the larger perspectives on this from an environmental perspective is that millimeter waves are virtually absent from the environment, period. There is no millimeter wave background noise at all. And the reason for that is because it is maximally absorbed at the 60 hertz frequency by atmospheric water molecules. And so the Russians, there were several really good papers that speculated that it's this complete absence from the environment that allowed so many species to make use of the millimeter wave frequencies for intercellular communications. It is so fundamental to how various species interact with this area of the environment. And this hasn't been written about at all, but it's the perfect place. And I think Libby is now in the process of creating another perfect platform to really explore the exact ways that this needs to go in order to broaden it to an environmental perspective that is going to get us away from the tried and true argument of thermal versus non-thermal. We are, when it comes to the science and really understanding this in a larger envelope, we are way beyond that conversation now. In reality, we actually are beyond that. When it comes to that fundamental argument of thermal versus non-thermal, we also, and again, Libby's new platform is the perfect place to address this. We need to challenge the basic underlying physics model of thermodynamics that thermal model is predicated upon. There's some very good research and discussion by Demetrios Panagopoulos and Michael from Greece, and from Michael Telig in Israel, in which they opened up a dialogue, and the two of them have some very good papers about this, about whether the classic physics model of thermodynamics even applies to non-ionizing radiation and current exposures, because really in the environment, these exposures behave more like photon packets as opposed to individual photons working on individual cells, which is what the thermodynamic model that all of the standards are based upon exists. And that's why you hear non-ionizing radiation doesn't have enough energy to knock electrons off of cellular orbits, therefore it can't cause heating. I mean, that's that whole classic model. But we need to go directly to the heart of challenging the validity of that model, given what today's exposures actually are. And we haven't gone there yet. So that I think is one of the next steps that we need to take in answer to the question.
That's great. People want to chime in. I have, I think, a related question for Sharon Bacino, and that is, you've been working now on the NEPA policy and through that, and the NRDC has been involved variably through the years, but how do you think the NRDC is going to be more involved with this? Because environmental groups have been very active when they have some success and they have a lot of communication ability, through their members to highlight this effect on wildlife. And what do you think the NRDC is going to do in the future? And how can we get other groups like the Sierra Club and others involved in this discussion and conversation?
So a couple quick points on that. So NRDC's focus has been on the ensuring the integrity of the environmental review and public participation, and that is an issue that runs across all of our work, whether we're working on the public lands or waters or in communities, and that is where we're likely to stay focused in the short term, and that's primarily because of the environmental community is dealing with climate change, and
Right.
we've got our hands
Right.
full with that.
Exactly.
What we are looking for now, though, is solutions that we're facing numerous kind of existential crises. And so if we can find work and focus in on the things that address all of those crises, and this is an emerging one, and then that is going to be the key, and that is what groups like NRDC and Sierra Club are looking for. The second point I'd like to make is just to address, there were a couple questions raised about the connection to environmental justice, and of course equity and inclusion are critical themes. I'll just speak for the environmental movement. As we move forward, we need to be working in new ways and working with new people and constituencies. I think this can be an environmental justice issue. In my view, it's not really seen that way right now. One thing that could help is I've become a big fan. I'm not a practitioner of it myself, but of GIS work and geographic information systems, and to collect the data, even if it's done in one community, to show that there is disproportionate impact. I don't know what it will show in this case. One of the big problems is that the companies are going to the areas that are already served and where the wealth is. And so how the impacts of where the networks are going, it may not play out in the same way that our traditional pollution problems like waste dumps do. We cannot, NRDC in this work cannot ignore the issue of equitable access. But how you deliver that access, deliver it in a safe way, deliver it with some of these wired solutions. So those are a few thoughts.
Sandy, I'd like to say something.
oh.
I'd like to say that I'd like to go back to this paper that Beatrice Gollin reported out that NAS concurs with and the State Department concurs with. There's no other plausible explanation for what may have harmed these diplomats. And we're really talking about what's the source: targeted microwave targeting of these individuals, surveillance. It's a byproduct of just surveillance, which of course a lot of governments do that, or just use of wireless technologies in these environments that are harming people. But nevertheless, the implications go far beyond the diplomats. Now, any policy solution at this point is not possible because, as Blake points out, the science is still not really confirming the biological effects. We're just getting started on that now to come up with some guidelines on the biological based guidelines. But so we would call for precautionary measures, and we have been calling for those. But I understand in the United States, the industry has been pretty firm, and apparently they believe they have cause to say they only would accept a precautionary measure if the science is 100% with certain, which is kind of crazy because that's not a precautionary measure then, is it? But in Europe, however, since 2012, the Council of Europe has recognized the need for precautionary measures when it comes to electromagnetic fields. So that's a big difference. So I don't know what avenues are open to us when we call for precautionary measures in US policy.
I'd like to add something onto this conversation, which will piggyback on what you were saying, Libby, but also related to environmental justice, because cell towers in our community, we did map out the cell towers on schools, and we found they were disproportionately placed in lower income areas with higher minorities and higher Black and brown communities. We have found that private schools will get the funding to install wired networks and reduce radio frequency radiation. People who are in occupations where they have a choice, like mine, I'm fully wired, I have that privilege, whereas many people who are not able to have that privilege, and wealthier educated families can inform their children on how to decrease exposure, like keep the phone away from your brain, and they have the financial means to buy these $100 adapters whereas many people do not have that ability. And schools in low-income areas are now being used as test beds for the wireless industry's 5G network. You can just look up what's happening in Cleveland and see how that is happening. In fact, I think schools in under-resourced schools are really being used for companies to test how their products work, what people like, and so forth. So I think that healthcare inequities will also further exacerbate the health inequalities that people in under-resourced communities face, because they're going to receive unequal care for the damages from exposure to radio frequency radiation. And finally, because they are more exposed to pollutants, and because of the research showing a synergistic effect between electromagnetic fields and other known toxins and carcinogens, tumor promotion, potentiation, then we're going to see an inadequate and disproportionate effects for that reason as well, people who live on highways and with more air pollution. So I think that it is a really important area that we need to address. And then hopping back to the occupational health issues for the people who have no choice on this and can't just change jobs or, get wired things. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Great, great. That's awesome.
Could I jump in with a question, Cindy?
Sure.
We have a person in the audience who comes from Massachusetts, and she said that she didn't want to have a smart water meter in her home, and she had letters from doctors for her utility, and what they decided to do is they decided to shut off her water. It turns out that for her to have heat, she needs water as well. And so for 2 years, she hasn't had water or heat in her home. And I'm wondering if Sharon or Cece or someone else could comment on what her options are. I mean, to me, this is totally unacceptable for someone living in the United States not to have water and heat.
It is. It's heartbreaking. And especially during the COVID pandemic, where our communities are being told that you have to wash your hands frequently. Well, I know this woman, and she has to go out and buy water, which is sometimes limited in the stores. She has to shower elsewhere and try and keep herself warm in a New England winter. So it is horrific that our communities are not listening to the public. And in this particular case, her town put in the smart meters. It's not done through the two major Eversource or National Grid. Right. Her town runs that. So this is her own town failing her when she has doctor's notices that RF will compromise her health. So we have been trying to get legislators to tune into this, but there is, I think, so much conflict of interest that people are scared to jump in and do the right thing. So Sharon, I would love to hear what recommendations you have.
No easy ones, unfortunately. I mean, this is an area that is about political will and the failure of political courage to serve constituents. In terms of the law, I really have dealt in the federal regulatory space as opposed to the tort or liability space. But that's not what somebody wants to have to do to go sue. So it's really a question, as we've been discussing the whole morning, how do you marshal the political pressure to get our elected officials to do what their constituents need?
Yeah, and
I think.
Can I jump in for a second? Yeah. One way around that, CC, would be to push for statewide opt-out bills, opt-out plans for any RF meters.
We are actually filing one this session. It's been on our books here for 8 years already. It is coming back next session, or this session that just began in January. And we have seen the needle move a little bit. Our Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy, for the first time in 8 years, reported that bill out favorably, but then it timed out in December. So it's back this session, and we are trying to do that. So we remain hopeful, but we also encourage everybody to take that New Hampshire law and go speak to your town administrators, go speak to your town state senator and state representative, and go to your federal delegates too, because until the law changes, all this is happening is one-offs, and we need big protections from the top of the house, and too many people at the grassroots level are suffering. So some people can get out and advocate for themselves. Others are too sick to do that. So we try and help and do what we can. And I'm so grateful for what Patty and Doug would do with 5gcrisis.com, because they do have tools to get us what we need to start this conversation in a polite, professional way in our communities. But we've got to be persistent, and we've got to stay on top of it, because nobody's going to fix it but us.
In Connecticut, there's a push at the state level in our Energy and Tech Committee to have Connecticut go completely smart. Now we have the same utility consortium as you do, EverSource, down here. It's interesting to note that originally EverSource, going back probably 5 to 7 years, they were the first to actually propose what was called an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out, meaning that what they wanted to do was include something in the of their billing that would allow people to opt in to a smart meter that would allow them a different rate during the day versus real-time pricing plans. And Connecticut actually shot that down because the Energy and Environmental Protection Agency at that point was really pushing for a smart grid, supposedly to save energy. Whenever one of the arguments that is rarely made in writing these bills, and I'm working with a couple of legislators now in Connecticut to try to at least get an opt-out put into, even if it's just a very broad bill to see what we can accomplish. But one of the points that someone passed over in one of the conversations in one of the modules during the conference is that whenever you introduce a higher frequency into the electric generating schemata, what you end up with is more higher energy use. And so the minute you go smart, you're not saving energy. You're doing the exact opposite.
No.
As a matter of fact, I started to write a book on the smart grid, and I never finished it, going back several years ago. And one of the things that I discovered is that beginning in the mid 2000s, the American Manufacturers Association very actively lobbied the EPA to allow them a higher energy use on all smart appliances that are going into homes in order to still qualify for the Energy Star program. It's amazing that they actually got that. So any of the smart appliances that we're buying actually put out more energy than less energy. We're much better off with simple mechanical models. And so again, that's putting the lie to the entire rationale of going smart that is often being pushed by environmental groups, unfortunately. But there we have it. A lot of it just has to do with the fact that people don't understand how to really introduce, they don't understand the electromagnetic spectrum and how it works is really what it is. And there's a division between the environmentalists and the physicists and the engineers that bring us the technology. And that's part of the divide that we have to close up. But statewide opt-out or opt-in, which would be preferable bills, would go a long way toward helping individuals have to fight this at the local level, which is ridiculous and dangerous.
As I mentioned, we have a bill that's proposed in Massachusetts. So anybody who wants to take a look at that, if you go out to my research repository, if you just, do a search on CC Doucette Understanding EMFs, I've got a page in there with all the bills we had last session, and you could take that language and take it back to your own communities. So we've got some models there.
Thank you,
Great.
Cindy. I'm gonna tap into that and use that.
There have been
Right.
many bills introduced in the Congress that have gone nowhere, starting back in 1999 to repeal the Federal Telecom Act, to call for a long-term independent research program funded by our federal government, put labeling on phones. There have been a lot of attempts, including in California. There was a bill that passed that called for review of research, and it was killed by the industry the following summer. A no money bill that was killed in the 2000s. So the industry is blocking policy change, and you need to fight against that at every level.
I put a
So
link in the chat to the US policy if you want to look at some history.
Okay, and thank you. I think we only have a few more minutes, but this comes to a lot of people that are concerned about, what can we do and what's the most important policy that we can put in place. And I think that I want to come back to a couple of things before we finish, some important questions for the panelists. but one of these is the FCC lawsuit that Children's Health Defense and Environmental Health Trust have brought forward. It's very, very important as a foundation for this. And I want to see if there's any other panelists that want to just comment about this as really a fundamental change. And I know, Sharon Bicchino, you filed an amicus brief as well. Do anybody have a few final comments about this? And
Yeah, I'm happy to address that quickly. Both Theodore and I listened to the case. Actually, oral argument was held before the DC Circuit just this last Monday. And both of us were able to listen to that. It was encouraging in that there are 3 justices of the DC Circuit that listened to each case. 2 of them asked very pointed questions of the FCC regarding the failure to respond to a lot of the evidence in the record, and also really the failure. They rely on the FDA, but one critical point that the justices themselves made was that the FCC had sent a letter to the FDA with all of these lists of questions that were pretty comprehensive, including about impacts on the environment, non-human impacts. The FDA's letter, which is very short in response, which is in the record, didn't answer any of them, and the judges wanted to know why. And the key point here is that the FCC's decision will be evaluated on the evidence before it, and there just isn't the evidence to support their decision to terminate their inquiry into the adequacy of the RF standards. So it will take a few months for a decision to come out, but that is definitely something to watch for. And what it could do is open up the possibility to get standards that are adequate.
great.
And I'll add that in 2012, there was a federal law that was proposed that would have called for biologically based limits by the EPA, which is needed. Now, we also need, of course, limits that address birds, bees, and trees, but that was proposed and not passed. But there have been many efforts in the past.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes.
One of the things that really might help, and this we could do legislatively, and the FCC might even go along with this, is request that the National Research Council Press, or the NRCP, would convene another special panel the way they did in 1995, which is the standards that were created that were then adopted by FCC for civilian exposures. The National Research Council, or National Radiation Protection Association is what I'm struggling to find, NRCP. They are the ones that's the only organization that's actually mandated by Congress to set standards and do reviews for radiation issues. Now, we're also not going to get very far unless we can get a very small research program directed to the Environmental Protection Agency to at least fund, if not primary research the way they used to have, at least some sort of oversight and review. And if we could at least get Congress to insist that the EPA fund at least 2 bioelectromagnetics research positions to stay on top of the research, that would also help. That's a low-level thing, short of just jumping in and trying to refund the EPA altogether. The other thing having to do with the case, and this is a point that I wish had been argued more, because I could tell in listening to oral arguments that the judges were themselves struggling with this issue, and it could have been easily pointed out to them that the FCC standards, the specific absorption rate is for cell phones, it's for near body exposures, but the FDA standards also cover ambient exposures, far field exposures. That's what the EPA is responsible for. Without the EPA's program being in existence to at least comment to FCC, there's like the third leg of the stool upon which they set their standards is completely absent from the field. And I think that's what the judges were struggling with. If someone had pointed out the difference between an ambient versus an SAR, and why FDA commented and EPA did not. huge hole in the regulatory apparatus there that could have, and it would be helpful if there's some way to point that out to the judges, or even just use that in subsequent cases that may arise. But there are two ideas: a small appropriation for at least two job definitions at the EPA, because at the moment I don't think they even have anyone dedicated to bioelectromagnetics. At one time, all of the participants in the radio frequency interagency work group, all of those agencies had bioelectromagnetics scientists that were part of the civilian scientific corps that were part of those agencies. And now there's virtually none of them. I think OSHA has one or two, and IEHS.
Right.
It's virtually absent from the field. So we need to fund the positions within the agencies, if not the entire separate program. So at least there is the ability to comment to FCC. So
Right.